Today I'm bringing you a sharp and aggressive defense, packed with traps, but rock solid. It's so uncomfortable to face that most e4 players are completely lost. The Stafford Gambit turns their first move into a trap for themselves. We play pawn to e5, they go knight to f3, and now, if we play knight to c6, we'd be heading into the usual lines like bishop to b5, the Ruy Lopez, or bishop to c4. That's what your opponent expects. But instead, we play knight to f6, entering the Petrov defense, also known as the Russian, with one goal: offer a gambit, throw your opponent off prep, and drag them into a position full of traps. In just a few minutes, I'll walk you through over 10 traps for black in this line. The best part? You're counterattacking the pawn, and most of the time, your opponent will ignore it and play bishop to c4. That's the Italian, and believe it or not, modern theory says this is better for black. What they're trying to do is dodge all Russian defense theory. So instead of knight takes, they go straight for bishop to c4, hoping that if we take their pawn, they'll win ours and put pressure on f7. A lot of beginners look at this and think black is worse, but that's completely wrong. The idea now is that black has the move d5, kicking the bishop. It doesn't matter if it retreats to b3 or checks on b5. Once it pulls back, we go queen to g5, attacking both the knight and the g2 square. One of them will fall. Black is simply much better from this position. So we've already started with a trap in case your opponent declines to enter the gambit. Knight to c3 is another way to decline. That leads to the four knights game. Unfortunately, a slightly quieter, more symmetrical variation. You're going to play knight to c6, and the most common reply is bishop to c4. It's not the best move. The best move would be converting into a Ruy Lopez with bishop to b5. But if they go bishop to c4, we can simply capture the pawn on e4 and once again catch the opponent in another tactic. Think about it. Have you ever seen this many traps in just a few moves? I bet not, and we're just getting started. When they recapture our knight on e4, we have the d5 pawn fork. Now, if they take our pawn, we're actually much better. Look at this. Queen takes d5, and black is the only one with a centralized pawn. The knight comes back to hit our queen, and once we retreated to d6, we have a very clear plan. We have a pawn in the center, and our opponent doesn't. Our development is completely natural, with bishop to g4 and long castling, while white is in a position they're totally unprepared for. Stockfish already gives black a full point advantage, and that's with no material lead. Just imagine once the pieces start falling. Now that we've covered what to do if your opponent declines the gambit, let's get to the fun part. Knight takes d5, and the Stafford Gambit invites white to take that pawn. But instead of kicking the knight and counterattacking, which would be the usual Russian-style game, we play knight to c6, offering a trade. That trade looks natural to white since they're ahead in material, so they usually take. And when they capture on c6, we recapture with the d pawn. The idea behind the gambit is this. We open up our queen, we unleash beautiful diagonals for both bishops, and we already have a knight developed, attacking the pawn on e4. Now that we're targeting that pawn, white has three main ways to defend it. If they just give it up, we take, and we're clearly better, equal in material, but much more developed. So what can they do? Either push the pawn forward, gaining space and kicking our knight, or play d3 to defend it solidly, or go knight to c3, defending the pawn while developing a piece. Anything else fails to defend the pawn or leads to a significantly worse position. For example, bishop to d3 doesn't make any sense. It blocks their own pawns and doesn't address any of our future threats. Let's start with the advanced variation, which is pawn to e5. Now, your opponent is kicking our knight, so we have to move it. Playing queen to e7, trying to keep the knight on f6, doesn't really work. Your opponent can just cover the threat with queen to e2, defending the pawn, and we end up throwing away our development advantage since the queen is blocking its own bishop. The position just isn't good, so we need to move the knight. The big question is, where? There are three main squares, g4, e4, and d5. I'm going to recommend the most aggressive one, which is e4. It's not the main line, so your opponent might be a bit out of their prep. You put the knight right in your opponent's face, and they basically have to ignore it. That's right. It's really common for your opponent to just try to kick the knight away, either with pawn to d3 or pawn to f3. And both of those moves lose badly. For example, pawn to f3 loses to queen to h4 check. And if they block the check with the g-pawn, you can just take it because the h-pawn is pinned. So black is just much better here. And the d-pawn push loses just as badly, but with even prettier moves. Here, black has a brilliant move that wins the game on the spot. Believe it or not, white is just lost from this position, even though it doesn't look lost at all. So the idea is bishop to c5. What a nasty move. You're attacking f2 with both the knight and the bishop, and if your opponent takes the knight, we capture on f2, and now they're going to lose their queen. All right, if he takes our bishop, we capture his queen. And if he steps his king forward, trying to hold on to the queen's defense, we play bishop to g4 check, winning the queen with a tactic called the skewer. At this point, he either has to capture the bishop or simply resign, which is what I think he should do after losing such a beautiful game like this. And believe it or not, this trap catches even very strong players. There's a 2600 rated player who fell for this. Now, let's check out what he might do after bishop to c5 instead of capturing the knight. One interesting try from the opponent is bishop to e3, trying to block the knight with his bishop, but it doesn't work. In fact, white falls into another trap here. We play bishop captures bishop on e3. And again, if he takes the knight, the same tactic works with bishop captures on f2. But if he captures the bishop, we have queen to h4, and we've seen something like this before. Look, if king to e2, queen to f2 is checkmate. And if the pawn moves to g3, the knight simply takes it. No problem because the h-pawn is pinned. So either way, black wins. Another try, instead of bishop to e3, is pushing the d-pawn. That's fine, we just take the pawn, no problem, right? We're back in the same situation, just one move later. Essentially, white's position is lost. However, if the opponent plays correctly, ignores the knight, and focuses on controlling the center, it's not over yet, because our queen comes to h4 anyway, and now we're threatening mate on f2. Your opponent probably isn't going to fall for the mate. But if they try to block the attack the wrong way, say by playing g3, which is a totally natural move, black wins. That's right. Here you can just capture on g3. No matter what your opponent does, you're going to win that rook in the corner. If they recapture with the f-pawn, for example, you play d4 check and pick up the rook. If they take with the h-pawn, you simply grab the rook. And if they don't take the knight and the knight takes the rook, either way, you're coming out ahead. Now, if your opponent doesn't fall for the trap and defends with the queen, for example, queen to f3, which would be their best move, you just use your lead in development. Play something like bishop e6, then go for long castling, and, well, now you'll actually have to play chess. But just to show it's not all that simple, playing g3 at any point is going to be a mistake. Okay, you can bring your knight back, hitting the queen. If there's a trade here, that's fine. The queen then threatens to infiltrate on c1. If not, let's say queen e3. You can just sacrifice your queen and win it back with a fork on f3. This just goes to show how powerful this gambit is. Even when your opponent plays pretty well and doesn't fall for the early tricks, your development advantage makes it really tough for them not to slip up somewhere along the way. This is in the pawn advance variation. Now, let's go over the other lines. But before that, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Even if it's not to play these traps, at least so you don't fall for them. And there's a lot of educational content here too. It's not just about gambits or traps, all right? So, let's get into it. If it's not the advanced variation, another natural move is d3. You just stick with the same ideas, playing bishop to c5. What's black aiming for here? Black's going after the f-pawn, right? There are all kinds of tactics involving that pawn. For example, one of the most common moves that immediately loses for white here is bishop to g5. And now you can deliver a beautiful mate by playing knight to e4. It's a checkmate very similar to Legal's mate. The idea is you sacrifice your queen, but then you take back on f2 with the bishop. And after that, you have bishop to g4, checkmate. And if your opponent doesn't take the queen, the mate is still pretty much unstoppable. Look, if they bring the bishop back to e3, that same pattern we saw before repeats. Bishop takes, and then queen to h4, followed by queen to f2, right? So keeping these attacking patterns against the f-pawn in mind is super important. Another common move in this position is bishop to e3, trying to get rid of the pressure on the f-pawn right away. That doesn't work because you can just take the bishop, and now the pressure that was on the f-pawn shifts to the doubled e-pawn, right? You play knight to g4, putting pressure on the pawn, and after the queen defends it, whether on e2 or f3, you keep up the pressure with something like queen to g5. The most common move in this position, for example, is for your opponent to defend the pawn again with the king. But that's a losing move. Losing to what? Knight takes h2, which is an incredible move. What's the idea here? You're attacking your opponent's queen, so if the queen moves, you simply trade pieces and retreat the knight with no issues. However, if they capture the knight, which is far more likely because it looks like you've lost your mind, you have queen to e5, forking the rooks. Take a look. The rook on the queen's side is under attack. You'll need to capture a pawn first, but the rook will fall anyway. And now you have a significant material advantage while your opponent's king remains stuck in the center. So if not bishop to e3, and if not bishop to g5, what's the move? The best option is a somewhat passive developing move, bishop to e2. This keeps an eye on the g4 square, which is a natural spot for your knight. From there, it can also put pressure on the f-pawn. Can you jump the knight there? Sure, you can. If they capture the knight, you play queen to h4, threatening mate and recovering the piece, right? If they castle, for example, bishop takes bishop, and you're relatively equal in material. However, I wouldn't recommend playing this way, trading pieces in a position where you're a pawn bound. Trading pieces without a good reason in this kind of position is not a good idea. It's often better to play the move pawn to h5 so that your knight can jump in. If your opponent captures the knight, at least you've opened up the h-file for an attack. For example, castling is a very common reply here, and then you jump with the knight to g4. If your opponent captures it, the h-file becomes a direct target. Let's say they play bishop to e3. That looks like a reasonable try. But now you play queen to h4, and they'll have to do something to stop the mate threat, like pawn to h3, and then you simply take the pawn and blow open their king's position. At that point, I'd say checkmate is almost inevitable. It's only a matter of a few more moves. So after the move pawn to h5, your opponent really needs to keep their king in the center. They might try something like pawn to c3, just continuing development with the king still uncastled, and your plan stays the same. Knight to g4, queen to f6, piling pressure on the g and f pawns. The position pretty much plays itself from there. Now, the last variation we need to cover is knight to c3 to defend the pawn, and we stick to the same ideas. Bishop to c5, putting pressure on the f2 square, but more importantly, stopping any immediate idea of central expansion with pawn to b4, all right? Most likely, your opponent will go for bishop to c4, by far the most common move in this position. They think they're just playing in Italian with an extra pawn, but they're not. You're about to show them why this gambit is so powerful by playing knight to g4, threatening a kind of reverse fried liver against the pawn on f2. What's the difference? They can't just defend that pawn with the queen's pawn without losing it. And if they castle, there's actually a very well-known checkmate pattern here. You bring your queen to h4, and now you've got 3 attackers on f2 while also threatening checkmate on h2. You're basically baiting the move h3, and when they play it, you just take it with the knight. The most natural response for your opponent is to just give up the rook, lose a bunch of material, and be left with their king totally exposed. A lot of opponents will just try to sidestep the threat by moving their queen, something like queen to f3, for instance. And in this case, you actually have checkmate. And the pattern is fairly straightforward, even though the mate itself takes a few moves. It's mate in 7, but all you have to do is keep giving checks. Knight takes h3, check. Your opponent has to move the king to h2 because it's a double check. You can't just capture the knight or block it. There's no way out. Knight to f2 is a discovered check from the queen. If they block with the queen, you could just capture it and not worry about it anymore. But there's also a cleaner mate by starting with bishop to d6, forcing the king away from defending the queen. So for example, once the king moves here, you take with check, bring your queen to g3, and finish the mate on h2, right? And if at any point, instead of blocking with the queen, they move the king to g1, then it's mate on h1. So castling is not a valid defensive idea here to protect the f2 pawn. What should they do to defend? They should play rook to f1. And here's the one trap. You can't get greedy. Knight takes h2 loses on the spot. How does that lose instantly? If knight takes h2, your opponent actually has a very similar tactic, just in reverse. They'll play queen to h5, hitting the knight and threatening the f-pawn at the same time. So yeah, don't get greedy, just castle instead. Instead of grabbing the pawn, just go ahead and castle and your position is perfectly fine. And if your opponent kicks your knight, no problem. You thought the traps were over? Nope. Here's one last trick to finish the video in style. Bishop takes f2. Your opponent can't capture it because if they trade everything down at the end of the line, you've got queen to d4, winning a piece and taking the game. That's it. Hope you enjoyed this. Putting this video together took a lot of work. Tons of ideas, traps, and specific move orders to get just right. If this video helped you out in any way, drop a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps a lot, and I'll see you in the next one.